On June 16th, the situation suddenly changed at the highly anticipated G7 summit, making this high-level meeting even more eye-catching. Before going to Canada to attend the summit, US President Trump announced that he would reach trade agreements with many countries, showing a strong attitude. However, after signing only one agreement, Trump returned home overnight on the grounds that he had something to do, which seemed a bit grand but ineffective. However, before leaving, Trump dropped a bombshell. He wanted to invite China to join the G7. This unexpected remark quickly sparked heated discussions. At the opening ceremony of the summit, he claimed that it was a mistake to expel Russia from the G8, and that Russia should be invited to return to the G8, and suggested inviting China to join. Some public opinion believes that given China's current international influence and rapid economic growth, joining the G7 may further accelerate China's development. However, if China really considers joining the G7, it may soon fall into Trump's trap. Why is this so? To answer this question, we need to understand Trump's true intentions from two perspectives. First, the decline in the influence of the G7 makes it increasingly difficult to represent the development of emerging global countries. Even during Trump's first term as president, he publicly stated that the G7 was very outdated. This is not groundless. When the G7 was first established, the combined GDP of the 7 member countries accounted for more than 60% of the global economy, so it was called the Rich Club. However, with the rise of emerging economies around the world, the economic advantage of the G7 is gradually weakening. In 2023, the combined GDP of the G7 will only account for about 30% of the global economy. If calculated by purchasing power parity, the combined GDP of the BRICS countries, which were only established in 2006, has exceeded that of the G7. This shows that economic growth has been weak in recent years and the group has long lost its former glory. Against this background, the international community has long questioned, how can this rich club that excludes emerging countries represent the world today? From 2000 to 2024, China's share of global GDP has increased from 3.6% to 17%, an increase of nearly 5 times. Currently, China's GDP is about $19 trillion, second only to the United States. Therefore, China has long had the strength to join the group of 7 G7. Once China joins the G7 and forms the G8, China's GDP will account for 26.8% of the entire G8, which will bring the G8's share of global GDP back to more than 60%, back to the level of the 1970s and 1990s. Therefore, from a purely economic perspective, China should have joined the G7 and participated in the formulation of economic rules long ago. Trump's hidden motives: political stage, destabilization, and the New World Order. Secondly, while Trump believes that the G7 is outdated, he suddenly invites other countries to join his globally watched stage. Is this really out of respect and goodwill? More importantly, shouldn't the sudden opening of the door to China by the Western group, which has always regarded China as a competitor, arouse vigilance? Some analysts believe that this contradiction reveals Trump's triple motives. Hypocritical political performance: he singled out China, put China in the spotlight, and plunged it into a more complex and fierce public opinion war. This is a common trick used by the United States. Breaking the status quo: as the leader of the G7, Trump personally punctured the false prosperity of the G7, making allies more aware that they must reform and find a way out. Otherwise, they will be further left behind by emerging countries. In the process of promoting reform, Western countries will inevitably further strengthen their dependence on the United States. Two-pronged approach. This is like an old saying: if you can't beat it, join it. The rise of emerging countries represented by China is an irreversible trend, and it may not be a bad thing to include China in the G7. This can not only further enhance the international influence of the G7, but also allow the United States to use the G7 framework to check and balance China. After all, the United States has been the leader of the G7 for many years, and even if China joins, the United States will not allow China to have too much say. China's position remains unchanged: reject the G7 and empower emerging economies. However, China has taken the initiative and interrupted Trump's calculations. Lin Jian, a spokesman for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said recently, we advise the G7 to recognize the world trend and stop manipulating issues involving China. This concise remark hits the core issue directly. Recognizing global trends means that the G7 continues to view the development of emerging nations through a Cold War mentality, failing to recognize that a multipolar world is not a future trend but a present reality. They have underestimated the potential of emerging nations and treated them with an arrogant, condescending attitude, which is a serious strategic misjudgment. Stopping manipulation exposes the hypocrisy of Western countries, who say one thing and do another, engaging in political theatrics. In fact, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has long pointed out that the current G7 cannot reflect current global economic dynamics and is no longer representative. The G20, which includes rapidly growing emerging economies such as China, India, and Brazil, is the true engine of the global economy. Since China has already joined the rapidly rising G20, why would it join the declining G7 and allow itself to be manipulated by the West? Trump's smokescreen cannot deceive China. China will continue to work within the framework of emerging nations like the G20 to secure greater voice for more overlooked developing countries and inject positive energy into global peace, stability, and development. However, Trump's statement has alarmed India and South Korea. South Korea has repeatedly proclaimed itself a developed country and eligible to join the G7, but the US has consistently refused to agree. Meanwhile, India, with its inflated self-importance, continues to assert that it has become the world's fourth largest economy, surpassing most of the G7 summit countries, and therefore advocates for joining the G7 to become a key player influencing the global economic trajectory. But Americans are not foolish. Neither India nor South Korea plays a significant role in global geopolitics. South Korea is a political, economic, and military vassal of the United States, fundamentally lacking the ability to independently formulate its own political and economic policies. Even its military command is not in its own hands, let alone become a major power. India, on the other hand, is even more of a lost cause. India's international environment and industrial foundation at the time of its founding were much stronger than China's, yet it has been far outpaced by China in development. In terms of military development, while India's defense industry exists, its weaponry and equipment are primarily imported. Aircraft carriers built for over a decade are launched before completion, aircraft developed for 30 years become obsolete before entering service, and tanks designed for 30 years are severely overweight, to the point that the Indian Army is unwilling to accept them. Clearly, Trump dismisses the demands of these two countries. It can be said that this summit failed to address any of Trump's concerns. The allies merely made demands, while refusing to agree to any of America's. This explains why Trump left the meeting in Canada on the 16th after dinner with other leaders, skipping the second day's summit agenda. The White House stated that President Trump needed to return home to deal with the situation in the Middle East. This is merely one reason. Another inconvenient truth is that Trump felt the meeting had no real purpose and saw no need to waste his time. This also reflects Trump's pragmatic and highly transactional approach to diplomacy. The G7 summit has always been more about optics than substance. When outweighs disagreements, the dialogue naturally flows well. However, once disagreements outweigh consensus, Trump will not hesitate to show his displeasure. In March 2018, Trump announced a 25% tariff on imported steel to the US at the G7 summit in June of the same year. The conflicts between Trump and other countries quickly came to light. Due to US opposition, the summit ultimately failed to reach a joint communique, and photos of Trump being besieged by other world leaders quickly went viral online. 7 years later, a similar scenario unfolded. Trump, having learned his lesson, left early, citing the Middle East situation. Sources told Reuters that several draft communiques prepared for this summit have not yet received US approval. At this point, it is likely clear to everyone why Trump suggested China joining the G7 or Russia's return. In his view, for the current G7 to be useful, other major powers should be brought in to discuss serious matters, rather than stubbornly adhering to the G7's original values and ideals. As he stated at a press conference at Mar-a-Lago in December last year, China and the United States can solve all the world's problems together. Think about that, it's very important. Trump's idea is not new. The concept of a US-China G2 emerged in the first decade of the 21st century. Many American conservative scholars complained about the G7's ineffectiveness and called for its replacement with a US-China duopoly or a US-China-Japan-Europe G4. Therefore, rather than saying Trump wants to bring China and Russia into the G7 to form a G8 or even a G9, it is more accurate to say that he desires a US-China G2 or a US-China-Russia G3 framework, where leaders of major powers sit down to talk and jointly decide the fate of the world. That's all for today's program. If you liked it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your clicks mean a lot to me. See you next time.